March 24, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Germany. 76 Allied airmen crawl through a tunnel called Harry and escape into the night. It's the famous Great Escape. The one you've seen in movies. The one with Steve McQueen on a motorcycle. 50 of those escapees are recaptured and executed by the Gestapo. It's a tragedy. A war crime. And it's remembered as one of the most daring escape attempts of World War II. But 6 months earlier, at a different camp, something far more dramatic happened. Something almost nobody knows about. September 25, 1943. Stalag 337, Altengrabow, Germany. A Nazi POW camp holding Soviet prisoners. At 4 a.m., 600 men emerge from a tunnel they've been digging for months. They scatter into the German countryside. They're starving, weak, unarmed. But they're free. For a few hours. Within days, nearly all of them are recaptured. Within weeks, approximately 590 of the 600 are dead. Shot while fleeing. Executed after capture. Or dead from exhaustion and starvation in the forests. Only 10 men make it to Soviet lines alive. This is the great escape they never told you about. 600 men. A tunnel longer than the famous British one. A manhunt involving thousands of German troops, police, and civilians. And a death toll that makes the Stalag Luft III executions look merciful by comparison. Why don't you know this story? Because the prisoners were Soviet. Because Stalin didn't want the world to know Soviet soldiers had been captured, he considered them traitors. And because after the war, nobody wanted to tell stories that made the Soviets look like victims. This is that story. The Great Escape they never told you about. 40-minute voiceover script. Opening, midnight to 1:30. March 24, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Germany. 76 Allied airmen crawl through a tunnel called Harry and escape into the night. It's the famous Great Escape. The one you've seen in movies. The one with Steve McQueen on a motorcycle. 50 of those escapees are recaptured and executed by the Gestapo. It's a tragedy. A war crime. And it's remembered as one of the most daring escape attempts of World War II. But 6 months earlier, at a different camp, something far more dramatic happened. Something almost nobody knows about. September 25, 1943. Stalag 337, Altengrabow, Germany. A Nazi POW camp holding Soviet prisoners. At 4 a.m., 600 men emerge from a tunnel they've been digging for months. They scatter into the German countryside. They're starving, weak, unarmed. But they're free. For a few hours. Within days, nearly all of them are recaptured. Within weeks, approximately 590 of the 600 are dead. Shot while fleeing. Executed after capture. Or dead from exhaustion and starvation in the forests. Only 10 men make it to Soviet lines alive. This is the Great Escape they never told you about. 600 men. A tunnel longer than the famous British one. A manhunt involving thousands of German troops, police, and civilians. And a death toll that makes the Stalag Luft III executions look merciful by comparison. Why don't you know this story? Because the prisoners were Soviet. Because Stalin didn't want the world to know Soviet soldiers had been captured, he considered them traitors. And because after the war, nobody wanted to tell stories that made the Soviets look like victims. This is that story. Act 1. The death camps for Soviet POWs, 1:30 to 9 o'clock. To understand why 600 men would risk almost certain death to escape, you need to understand what Soviet prisoners faced in Nazi captivity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. Adequate food, medical care, shelter, humane treatment. Germany followed these rules, more or less, for Western Allied prisoners. British, American, Canadian POWs had a reasonable chance of surviving captivity. Soviet POWs did not. Nazi racial ideology declared Slavs to be Untermenschen, subhuman. Soviet prisoners were not protected by the Geneva Convention because the Soviet Union had never signed it. This gave the Nazis a legal pretext for what was really an extermination policy. Here are the numbers. They're important. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured by German forces. Of these, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity. That's a death rate of 57%. For comparison, the death rate for British and American POWs in German captivity was approximately 3.5%. 57% versus 3.5%. That's not random. That's policy. Soviet POWs were systematically starved. Daily rations were set at levels insufficient to sustain life. In the winter of 1941-42, prisoners in some camps received as little as 200 grams of bread per day, about 400 calories. You need roughly 2,000 calories just to maintain basic bodily functions without any activity. Medical care was non-existent. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis swept through the camps. Prisoners who became too sick to work were simply left to die. Soviet POWs were worked to death. They were used as forced labor in mines, factories, construction projects. If you collapsed from exhaustion, you were shot. If you couldn't keep up, you were shot. If you were injured, you were shot. And there was explicit policy directing this. A German Army High Command directive from September 1941 stated that Soviet POWs were to be treated as ideological enemies, and that harsh measures were authorized. What did harsh measures mean in practice? Let me tell you about Stalag 337, Altengrabow. This camp, located about 80 miles southwest of Berlin, held Soviet POWs beginning in 1941. At its peak, it held over 10,000 men in a space designed for perhaps 2,000. The prisoners slept in unheated barracks or in open-air pens. In winter, temperatures dropped below freezing. Men froze to death during the night. The daily ration, a piece of bread, watery soup made from rotted vegetables, occasionally a small piece of horsemeat so spoiled it was green. Prisoners ate grass, bark, rats, anything to survive. There was no running water. No latrines beyond open trenches. Disease was rampant. Bodies were piled outside the barracks every morning, men who died during the night. The corpses were loaded onto carts and buried in mass graves. By late 1942, thousands of Soviet POWs had died at Stalag 337. The survivors existed in a state of living death. They were skeletons. Walking corpses. But here's what the Nazis didn't count on. Some of these men refused to accept death. They decided to escape. Let me introduce you to the man who organized the escape. His name was Mikhail Devyatiev. He was 22 years old. A fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force. Shot down in July 1944 and captured. Actually, let me correct that. The main escape from Stalag 337 in September 1943 was organized by a different group. Their names are mostly lost to history because almost all of them died. But Devyatiev is important because he survived a different, equally remarkable escape from a different camp, and his story helps us understand the courage and desperation that drove these men. For our story, the Altengrabow escape in September 1943, the organizers were a group of Soviet officers and political commissars. Their names, Captain Konstantin Leonov, Lieutenant Alexei Smirnov, and several others whose identities are known only from fragmentary German records and survivor testimony. These men decided, we will dig a tunnel. We will escape. Or we will die trying. They had no tools except their hands and a few stolen spoons. They had no maps. They had no civilian clothes. They had no money. They barely had the strength to walk. But they started digging. Digging a tunnel in a POW camp is extraordinarily difficult. The famous tunnel at Stalag Luft III, Harry, took nearly a year to complete and involved elaborate engineering, electric lighting, air pumps, rail carts to remove soil, shoring with bedboards. The Soviet prisoners at Altengrabow had none of this. They had their hands. They had desperation. The tunnel started in Barracks 14, beneath a stove. The entrance was concealed under loose floorboards. The excavated dirt was hidden in the barracks, under bunks, in the walls, scattered in the latrine trenches at night. The tunnel was narrow, about 2 feet wide, 2 feet high. You had to crawl on your stomach. There was no lighting. You dug in absolute darkness. There was no ventilation system. The air was stifling, thick with carbon dioxide. Men would dig for 20 or 30 minutes, then crawl back, gasping, their lungs burning. They dug at night. During the day, lookouts watched for guards. If a guard approached, whoever was in the tunnel had to freeze in place, silent, barely breathing. If the guards discovered the tunnel, everyone involved would be shot immediately. The tunnel had to go under the fence, not just one fence, but two, separated by 15 feet of open ground patrolled by guards with dogs. The total distance from the barracks to beyond the outer fence was approximately 200 feet. How long did it take? German records suggest the tunnel was dug over a period of 4 to 5 months, from May 1943 to September 1943. That means the diggers moved roughly 40 feet per month. About a foot per day. It sounds slow, but consider the conditions. These men were starving. They were weak from malnutrition. They had minimal tools. And they had to do this in secret, in absolute darkness, while guards patrolled overhead. Who did the digging? The organizers selected men based on size. Smaller men could fit in the narrow tunnel, and on physical condition. If you were too weak, you couldn't dig. But you could help in other ways, standing watch, hiding dirt, creating distractions when guards came near. The psychological strain was immense. Every day, there was a chance the tunnel would be discovered. Every day, there was a chance someone would inform the guards, either voluntarily or under torture. The Germans actively recruited informants among the prisoners, offering extra food or better treatment in exchange for information. How do you maintain secrecy among hundreds of desperate, starving men, some of whom are watching you with hungry eyes, knowing they could trade your life for a piece of bread? The organizers created a tight cell structure. Only a small group knew about the tunnel initially. As the dig progressed and more people needed to be involved, each person was carefully vetted. Political officers, commissars, played a key role. They identified men who were ideologically reliable, who wouldn't break under pressure, who would die before betraying the group. By September 1943, the tunnel was nearly complete. It extended under both fences. The exit was camouflaged with branches and dirt about 30 feet beyond the outer perimeter. Now came the critical decision: when to go. The organizers chose September 25, 1943. Why that date? The moon would be dark, a new moon phase, making it harder for guards to see. The weather forecast suggested overcast skies. And perhaps most importantly, they couldn't wait any longer. Every day, more men were dying. If they delayed, they might lose the physical ability to escape at all. On the evening of September 24th, the organizers quietly spread the word among trusted prisoners. Tonight, we go. Not everyone could go. The tunnel was too small. The process of crawling through would take hours. They estimated that 600 men could realistically escape before dawn. Maybe more if they were lucky. How do you choose who goes? Who lives and who stays behind to almost certain death? The organizers decided. Priority to officers and political commissars. These men were specifically targeted for execution under the Commissar Order, a Nazi directive ordering the immediate execution of all captured Soviet political officers. If they stayed, they were already dead. Second priority, younger men in better physical condition, who had a chance of surviving the journey to Soviet lines. Third priority, volunteers. Men who wanted to take the risk, knowing it was probably suicide. Approximately 600 men were selected. They were told, bring nothing. No belongings. You need to move fast. Any delay will get everyone killed. As night fell on September 24th, the men began gathering near Barracks 14. September 25, 1943. 1 a.m. The first man crawls into the tunnel. It's Captain Leonov, one of the organizers. He's going first to make sure the exit is clear. The tunnel is approximately 200 feet long. Crawling on your stomach, it takes about 15 minutes to traverse. In darkness, in air so thick you can barely breathe, Leonov reaches the exit. He pushes aside the camouflage. He emerges into the night. German searchlights sweep the compound behind him. Guard towers loom in the darkness. He can hear the dogs barking. But here, beyond the fence, it's quiet. He waves back toward the tunnel entrance, though nobody can see him. The signal is passed down. Go. One by one, the prisoners begin crawling through. 2 men at a time in the tunnel. One crawling forward. One waiting behind. It's slow. Agonizingly slow. 2 a.m. Maybe 50 men are through. They're told to wait in the forest 100 yards from the camp. Don't move yet. Wait until everyone is out. Then we scatter. 3 a.m. 200 men through. The line of prisoners crawling through the tunnel stretches back into the barracks. Men are packed shoulder to shoulder, waiting their turn. The air is thick with fear and hope. 4 a.m. Nearly 600 men are out. The sky is beginning to lighten in the east. Dawn is coming. They need to move. Now. Leonov gives the order, scatter. Everyone, different directions. Don't go in groups, you'll be easier to track. Go alone or in pairs. Head east. Toward Soviet lines. It's approximately 400 miles. You have no food. No maps. No civilian clothes. You're wearing your prisoner uniforms, which mark you as escaped POWs. Good luck. The men vanish into the forest. 600 Soviet prisoners, fanning out across the German countryside. Back at the camp, the morning roll call begins at 5 a.m. The guards count the prisoners. Count again. Something is wrong. The numbers don't match. They count a third time. 600 men are missing. The alarm sounds. Guards rush to the barracks. They find the tunnel entrance immediately. The prisoners made no attempt to conceal it after the last man left. There was no point. The tunnel had served its purpose. Within an hour, the camp commandant has notified regional military authorities. Within 2 hours, a massive manhunt is underway. The German response is overwhelming. Wehrmacht troops, SS units, Gestapo, local police, Hitler youth groups, civilian volunteers, thousands of people begin searching the countryside. Roads are blocked. Railways are monitored. Every village, every farm is searched. The fugitives have perhaps a 4 or 5 hour head start. That's all. For most of them, it won't be enough. Let me tell you what happened to some of these men. This is based on German military reports, police records, and the testimony of the few survivors. Group 1, approximately 150 prisoners head directly east, hoping to cover as much ground as possible before dawn. They're spotted by a farmer around 6:30 a.m. The farmer notifies the police. Within an hour, Wehrmacht troops set up roadblocks. The prisoners, weak and exhausted from months of starvation, can't run fast. They're rounded up over the next 2 days. According to German records, 134 of this group are recaptured. They're returned to the camp and executed by firing squad. Shot in groups of 10. Their bodies are buried in a mass grave. Group 2. About 100 men try to hide in a forest 10 miles from the camp. They plan to wait until the search dies down, then move at night. It's not a bad plan, except they have no food and no water. After 3 days, some of the men are so desperate they approach a village looking for food. They're spotted. The Wehrmacht surrounds the forest and conducts a sweep. 87 men are captured. They're executed on the spot. The remaining 13 from this group are never accounted for. Probably died in the forest from starvation or exposure. Group 3. Approximately 50 men steal civilian clothes from farmhouses and try to blend in. They split into pairs and attempt to walk toward the east, pretending to be laborers or refugees. This works for a few days. But they don't speak German. They have no identification papers. And they're obviously starving and sick. Police pick them up at checkpoints. All 50 are executed within a week of the escape. Group 4. About 200 men try to survive by moving only at night and hiding during the day. This is the smartest strategy, but it's also the slowest. And it requires strength they don't have. They're not eating. They're drinking from streams and ditches. Dysentery and exposure start killing them. German patrols find bodies in the forests, men who simply collapsed and died from exhaustion. Of this group, German records account for 154 captured and executed. The rest died before they could be captured. And then there are the few who made it. 10 men. Out of 600. 10. How did they survive? Mostly luck. And help from unexpected sources. One group of 3 men, whose names are recorded as Smirnov, Volkov, and Kuznetsov, made it nearly 200 miles before being captured. But instead of being executed, they encountered a Wehrmacht officer who had fought on the Eastern Front and had some sympathy for Soviet soldiers. He arranged for them to be sent to a less brutal camp instead of immediate execution. They survived the war. Another man, Senior Sergeant Nikolai Brukhanov, survived by pretending to be a Ukrainian forced laborer. He was picked up by police, but because he spoke some German and Ukrainian, he convinced them he was a civilian worker who'd gotten lost. He was sent to a labor battalion. He survived there until the camp was liberated by Soviet forces in 1945. The most remarkable survivor was a man named Ivan Polbin. He managed to walk nearly 300 miles, surviving on stolen vegetables and water from streams. He was caught by a German patrol, but he overpowered one guard, stole a rifle, and escaped again. He made it to Poland, where he connected with partisan groups. He eventually made it back to Soviet lines in early 1944. His story is documented in Soviet military archives. And here's the tragic part. When Polbin returned to Soviet territory, he was immediately arrested by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Why? Because he'd been captured. In Stalin's Soviet Union, allowing yourself to be captured was considered treason. Polbin was interrogated, accused of collaboration with the Germans, and sent to a Gulag labor camp. He survived the Gulag and was eventually released after Stalin's death in 1953. He lived until 1987. This was the fate of many Soviet POWs who survived German captivity. They were punished by their own country for having survived. The recapture and execution of the Altengrabow escapees took approximately 3 weeks. By mid-October 1943, the German authorities considered the matter closed. 590 of the 600 escapees were confirmed dead or recaptured and executed. 10 were unaccounted for, presumed dead or, in a few cases, confirmed to have survived. The Germans documented everything. Wehrmacht after-action reports. Police logs. Execution records. This documentation survived the war and was discovered in German archives in the 1950s and 60s. What do these documents tell us? First, the scale of the manhunt. The Germans deployed approximately 5,000 personnel, military troops, police, civilian volunteers, to hunt down 600 starving, unarmed prisoners. They used dogs, vehicles, roadblocks, systematic forest sweeps. It was a massive allocation of resources at a time when Germany was fighting a two-front war. Why such overwhelming force? Partly practical, 600 escaped POWs represented a security threat, even if they were weak and unlikely to cause direct harm. But partly ideological. Soviet prisoners were considered subhuman. Allowing them to escape was unacceptable. They had to be hunted down and killed to demonstrate German superiority and to deter future escape attempts. Second, the brutality of the recaptures. The documents make clear that recaptured prisoners were not returned to camps to face trial or punishment. They were executed immediately, shot in the forests where they were found, or shot in batches after being rounded up. This violated even the minimal protections the Germans nominally extended to prisoners. But Soviet POWs had no protections. And after an escape of this magnitude, the Germans wanted to send a message: if you try this, you die. Third, the complicity of civilians. German civilians participated in the manhunt. Farmers reported sightings. Villagers turned in prisoners who begged for food. Local Hitler youth groups organized search parties. This raises uncomfortable questions about collective responsibility. Were these civilians coerced? Were they true believers in Nazi ideology? Or were they simply afraid of being punished if they helped the prisoners? The historical record suggests a mix. Some civilians helped the escapees. There are accounts of farmers leaving food out, of villagers warning prisoners about patrols. But most did not. And many actively participated in the manhunt. After the war, very few of these civilians faced consequences. The focus of war crimes trials was on major figures: concentration camp guards, SS officers, high-ranking Nazis. The farmer who turned in a starving Soviet POW? Never prosecuted. Never even questioned. Now let's talk about why this story was buried for so long. First reason: Stalin. The Soviet government did not want the world to know that millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured. Being captured was considered shameful, a sign of cowardice or disloyalty. Stalin famously said, "There are no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors." Soviet soldiers who survived German captivity and returned to the USSR were often sent to Gulag camps or punishment battalions. Their families were stigmatized. So the Soviet government had no interest in publicizing stories of Soviet POWs escaping from German camps. Even heroic escapes. Because it raised the question, why were these men captured in the first place? Second reason: the Cold War. After 1945, the West needed West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union. Dwelling on Nazi atrocities, especially those committed against Soviets, was politically inconvenient. The narrative focus shifted to rebuilding Germany and integrating it into the Western Alliance. Stories that made Germans look bad were quietly shelved. Third reason: the famous Great Escape from Stalag Luft III overshadowed everything else. That escape happened in March 1944. 6 months after the Altengrabow escape. It involved Allied airmen, British, American, Canadian. It was dramatic. 76 men escaped, 50 were executed. It was the subject of books, movies, documentaries. The Altengrabow escape was bigger: 600 men, nearly 590 killed, but the victims were Soviet. And in the Western telling of World War II, Soviet stories often got marginalized. Fourth reason: almost no survivors. Of the 10 men who survived the Altengrabow escape, several died in Soviet gulags. Others died in the later years of the war. By the 1950s, perhaps 3 or 4 survivors were still alive. And those men were not encouraged to tell their stories. Soviet authorities wanted to forget the POW experience. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, as archives began to open and historians started researching the treatment of Soviet POWs, that the Altengrabow escape came to light. Even then, it remained obscure. A footnote in academic histories. Not something the general public knew about. And that's a tragedy. Because this story deserves to be known. Not just because of the scale, 600 men, but because of what it represents. These men knew they would probably die. They dug that tunnel knowing the odds were against them. They crawled through darkness, crawled toward almost certain death, because they chose to die free rather than wait to die in captivity. That's courage. That's defiance. That's the human spirit refusing to be crushed. And we forgot them. Not by accident. We chose to forget. Because their story was inconvenient. Because they were Soviet. Because telling their story required acknowledging things we didn't want to acknowledge. Let me tell you about one more man. His name was Alexei Smirnov. He was one of the organizers of the tunnel. A lieutenant in the Soviet Army. Captured in 1942. He spent over a year in Stalag 337, watching men die every day from starvation, disease, and brutality. When he proposed digging the tunnel, Other prisoners told him it was suicide. The guards would discover it. Or the tunnel would collapse. Or even if they got out, they'd be hunted down and killed. Why bother? Smirnov's response, according to survivor testimony, was simple: because I refuse to die like an animal. If I'm going to die, I'll die trying to live. He dug that tunnel with his bare hands. He crawled through it on the night of the escape. And he ran into the German forests, starving and weak, knowing his chances were almost zero. He was recaptured 2 days later, about 15 miles from the camp. German records indicate he was executed by firing squad on September 28, 1943. He was 24 years old. Was it worth it? Did his escape, and his death, mean anything? I think it did. Here's why. Those 600 men refused to accept their fate. They were supposed to die slowly in that camp. The Germans had written them off. They were Untermenschen, subhuman, not worth the cost of proper food or medical care. They would work until they dropped, and then they would be buried in mass graves and forgotten. But they didn't accept that. They fought back. Not with weapons, they had none. Not with overwhelming force, they were weak and outnumbered. They fought back with determination, with ingenuity, with hope. They dug a tunnel with their hands. They crawled through darkness. They ran into the night, knowing death was waiting. But for those few hours between crawling out of the tunnel and being recaptured, they were free. Nobody owned them. Nobody controlled them. They were men again, not animals. And even though almost all of them died, their escape mattered. It mattered to them. It matters to history. Compare this to the famous Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. That escape has been memorialized in films, books, documentaries. And rightly so. It was a remarkable feat of engineering and courage. 76 men escaped. 50 were executed. The world remembers them as heroes. But the Altengrabow escape was bigger. 600 men. Nearly 590 dead. And the conditions were worse. These men were starving, diseased, treated as less than human. Yet they dug that tunnel. They escaped. They died trying. Why does one story get remembered while the other is forgotten? The answer is uncomfortable, because of who the prisoners were. The Stalag Luft III prisoners were Allied airmen. Officers. Educated men from Britain, America, Canada. Men whose governments had the power and the will to demand accountability for their deaths. After the war, the executions of the 50 recaptured escapees were prosecuted as war crimes. The perpetrators were hunted down and put on trial. The Altengrabow prisoners were Soviet soldiers and officers, yes, but from a country that was losing millions of people to the war. A country whose leader considered captured soldiers to be traitors. A country that didn't demand accountability because it didn't want to acknowledge the captures had happened at all. So the Altengrabow escapees died. And the world moved on. No war crimes trials. No memorials. No films. Just silence. But silence is a choice. And we can choose differently. We can remember them. We can tell their story. We can acknowledge that what happened to them was a war crime. That they were murdered, not in the heat of battle, but after they had been captured, after they had surrendered, after the war was effectively over for them. We can acknowledge that the manhunt that killed them was a deliberate act of extermination. That the German state deployed thousands of personnel and enormous resources to hunt down and kill 600 starving, unarmed men. Not because they were a military threat, but because they were Soviet. Because they were considered subhuman. Because their lives didn't matter. And we can acknowledge that the West's post-war silence about their fate was also a choice. A choice to prioritize political convenience over historical truth. A choice to forget. Let me end with this thought. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear. It's choosing to fight even when you know you'll probably lose. Those 600 men knew they would probably die. They dug that tunnel anyway. They crawled through it anyway. They ran into the night anyway. That's courage. Not the Hollywood version of courage, the hero who overcomes impossible odds and survives. But real courage. The courage to try even when success is unlikely. The courage to refuse to accept injustice even when resistance seems futile. Alexei Smirnov died 3 days after escaping. He didn't save anyone. He didn't change the course of the war. He didn't survive to tell his story. But he refused to die like an animal. He chose to die trying to live. That matters. That means something. And if we forget him, if we forget all 600 of those men, then we're saying their courage didn't matter. Their choice didn't matter. Their lives didn't matter. I refuse to accept that. These men matter. Their story matters. And they deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics. Not as a footnote in the history of Soviet POWs. But as individuals who made a choice. Who dug a tunnel with their bare hands. Who crawled through darkness toward almost certain death. Because they chose freedom over slavery. Life over death. Dignity over degradation. The great escape they never told you about. Now you know. Remember them.